As I begin this morning, I want to start with an illustration from a Christian biography. I think it was one of the first ones that I read. I was probably in 8th or 9th grade, about the man George Mueller. Have you heard of George Mueller? You can see lived in the 1800s in England, in London and outside of London. He was a man of deep faith, and he had a holy burden. And this morning, as we begin the book of Nehemiah, we're going to be thinking about a holy burden. Here's an example of that. George Mueller said, "I was struck with the wretched condition of the many poor orphans in our city. I had often seen them, hungry and ill-clad, running about the streets with no one to care for them. My heart was moved with compassion for them." From that point, the Lord stirred in Mueller's life. He placed within his life, within his heart, a holy burden for the thousands of orphans that were wandering the streets of 19th century England. Now, he didn't have a lot of resources personally. He didn't have a lot of money, but he began to pray, and his burden led him to open, not just in London, but even outside the city, towards Bristol, and he would pray and he would trust God for daily provision. He said, "It was in November of 1835 that I began the work. I was led to it in order that I might have something to point to as a visible proof that our God and Father is the same faithful God that He ever was, as willing as ever to prove Himself the living God to all who put their trust in Him." By the end of his life, Mueller had cared for over 10,000 orphans. His testimony still inspires Christians today to trust God with burdens that are too great for human strength. When Mueller died at the age of 92 in 1898, the Daily Telegraph put together an article. And this is what the newspaper said. They said that Mueller had robbed the cruel streets of thousands of victims and the workhouses of thousands of helpless waifs. What began as a holy burden led Mueller to seek the Lord. He prayed that relief would come to the children, and his holy burden led to a deeper faith, which caused him to see that he would be part of the solution. This morning, we're beginning a new series in the book of Nehemiah. I've titled it, "God Renews His People." And like George Mueller, we're going to meet Nehemiah, who also had a holy burden. When he heard about the condition of his homeland, the place of his forefathers, the city where the great temple of his faith had once stood, it moved him. It moved him when he heard about the condition of the city. He began to weep. He even fasted and prayed. And through this holy burden, God prepared him to be part of the solution. Now, Nehemiah's story reminds us that when God puts a burden upon our hearts, He also gives us strength. He provides the provision, the opportunity to respond for His glory. As we're going to see in the coming weeks, Lord willing, Nehemiah was involved in a building project. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a priest. He was a man of faith. He was a man of prayer, and God worked mightily through him. I pray that even though we ourselves find a construction project all around us, that we will see that it's more than just something physical happening, something beyond the material. When God works, and He works within His people, and He molds and He shapes, yet the construction might even provide some frustration for some of us, maybe some more than others. Even in those frustrations, even within those times of sacrifice, there can be a work that the Lord is doing within us individually and as a body. Let's not miss that opportunity to see that God is doing more than a project that's material. God renews His people. Now, Nehemiah responds to the need, as I said, with brokenness, as we're going to read in just a moment, even with prayer and fasting. He shows us that the power of a burdened heart, when it is aligned with God's purposes, is really something to behold. So I ask you to join me as we begin the book of Nehemiah this morning. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 is where we'll begin. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. During the month of Kislev in the 20th year, when I was in the fortress city of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, arrived with men from Judah, and I questioned them about Jerusalem and the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile. They said to me, the remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down and its gates have been burned. We see, first of all, this morning, recognizing brokenness. He hears a report and he recognizes what is happening to the beloved city. As we begin the series, I'd like to point out a couple of things. And by the way, if you are still using the church app, all of the notes for the message today are still in that app. The quotes, the references, all of that is still available for you if it's something that you'd like to access. And you'll see there that begin the series by considering the author, the date, and the setting. And so as we jump into this book, it's good for us to ask ourselves, who is it that wrote it? So the book contains many first-hand accounts of Nehemiah. And what we'll see is that some of them are quotes from journals, from memoirs, but the other parts of the book speak of Nehemiah in the third person. So some of it's first person, some of it's third person. You might say, well, then who is it that wrote the book? Well, obviously portions of it he wrote himself because they're his memoirs, his words, but it's typically understood, traditionally understood, that Ezra was the author of Nehemiah. In fact, you may notice that the book of Ezra is right there next to and in position with Nehemiah. And in the earliest traditions, they were a single book. And so we think of it as coming with a single author, even though we realize that Ezra did work off of a lot of material that Nehemiah himself wrote. What about the date? Well, the events in Nehemiah begin during the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes. And if you look back at verse 1, you'll see that it says that this was the 20th year, meaning the 20th year of his reign. And so history tells us that this would be 446 BC. But as we know, the Bible does provide historical documentation. It also gives the month of Kislev. And from the Hebrew calendar to the calendar that we would be familiar with, this would be roughly mid-November to mid-December. We think about the setting. Verse 1 says that Nehemiah was in Susa. And for King Artaxerxes, this would be his winter palace. Now, this is the Persian Empire. And so we're not thinking about Israel, we're thinking about the modern nation of Iran. That's where Susa was located. You may think that you've heard this city name before in the Bible, and you have. This is where Esther became queen about a generation earlier. You may have also recalled when we were in the book of Daniel that there was a reference to Susa in one of Daniel's visions. But there is one more point that I want to make here, and it's actually from the end of verse 11. So we're going to fast forward, and don't worry, we'll get what's in between. But the very end of the chapter says, "At the time I was the king's cupbearer." And so this, again, is an important part of the account, because these records that Nehemiah wrote were official. He was the cupbearer of the king of Persia. He was a Jew who had been elevated to a position with great responsibility and even authority. Now, when we think of a cupbearer, we know that at each meal he would do what? He would eat the food before the king would, just to make sure that it had not been poisoned. But he was also one who had to understand the culture. He had to be knowledgeable of court procedures. He had to be able to converse with the king in a variety of settings, and at times would even serve as an advisor to the king if he were asked. In other words, Nehemiah had great influence. even though he was a Jewish man living in a Gentile nation. Does it remind you of others that God elevated into places of great influence in similar ways? I was thinking, what about Moses and the Pharaoh, or even Joseph, or as we studied Daniel and the Babylonian Empire? Maybe you think of Esther and Mordecai. These are all examples of God elevating the Jewish person of faith into a setting such as this. And here we have that in Nehemiah as well. Verse 2 says, "And Susa and one of his brothers came to tell him about Jewish exiles who had returned to Jerusalem." So you may be wondering, if Nehemiah is Jewish, what is he doing in Persia? Why is he there? Well, Nehemiah lived in the time after the people of Israel had been dispersed. You may recall that they had been overtaken by conquering armies. Just to give a little bit of history, going back even a couple of hundred years before the days of Nehemiah, the nation of Israel was divided. It was a divided kingdom, northern and southern. And the first to fall was the northern. They were taken captive by the Assyrians around 722 BC, so about 300 years before the days of Nehemiah. The southern kingdom held on a little longer, but you may recall during the days of Jeremiah, it fell as well. This would have been around 586 BC and fell to the Babylonians. But after 70 years of Babylonian captivity, another world power exerted its dominance. You know who that was? The Persian Empire. And it took over the Babylonians, and led by Cyrus the Great, they overthrew them in 539. We saw this when we were in the book of Daniel a couple of years ago. And so Cyrus and subsequent kings of the Medo-Persian dynasty began releasing the Jewish people from their exile in Babylon. In a succession of waves, the Hebrew people began returning to Jerusalem. And what did they find? They found their city was in ruins. The physical infrastructure had crumbled, the economy had withered, the religious life but dead. The first ones to return were led by Zerubbabel. They began rebuilding the temple. The prophets Zechariah and Haggai provided spiritual leadership. The temple was completed in 515 BC. By 458 BC, another group of Jews also returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of the priest Ezra. And I bring you to that point because that's where we find Nehemiah. This is the time frame for him. That history is important so that we understand why these verses are talking about exiles. And that's the framework. That's the reason why. But he hears a report from his brother Hanani that his report that he heard was not encouraging. Look again at verse 3. "They said to me, the remnant in the province who survived the exile are in great trouble and disgrace. Jerusalem's wall has been broken down and its gates have been burned." One commentator described the situation like this. 3 words summarize the bad news: remnant, ruin, and reproach. Instead of a land inhabited by a great nation, and think about what that nation looked like at one time. Think about the days of David or Solomon. Think about what they looked like at one time, but now they were in great affliction, struggling to survive. Instead of a magnificent city, Jerusalem was in shambles, and where there had been once great glory, there was now nothing but great reproach. Without walls and gates, the city was open to ridicule and attack. In these opening verses, Nehemiah hears the devastating report about Jerusalem. He recognizes the brokenness that is there in the main city of his homeland. And so in recognizing the brokenness, we might ask, well then, how does he respond? He gets this report. Is it going to be one of those, well, that's not my problem kind of responses? Is it going to be, well, there's other people that are there that can do something about it? Is that how Nehemiah will respond? Well, let's read. Let's pick back up where we left off. Verse 4. "When I heard these words, I sat down and wept. I mourned for a number of days, fasting and praying before the God of heavens. I said, Lord, the God of the heavens, the great and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keep his commands. Let your eyes be open and your ears be attentive to hear your servant's prayer that I now pray to you day and night for your servants, the Israelites. I confess the sins we have committed against you. Both I and my father's family have sinned. We have acted corruptly toward you and have not kept the commands, statutes, and ordinances you gave your servant Moses. From recognizing brokenness, secondly, we see response. He's responding in prayer. Nehemiah is in deep mourning. He's troubled by what he heard. He probably was hoping that the report back would be a lot more positive, don't you think? Don't you think he was hoping that the report back, now this isn't the days of the internet, right? Not even the days of the Pony Express. These are ancient days, and so when he finally gets a report, it's troubling. It doesn't meet the expectations that he probably had. All of this led him to pray. What we have begun reading this morning is the first of 9 prayers in the book of Nehemiah. The prayer opens in verse 5 with words of praise. Notice how God is described. An awe-inspiring, covenant-keeping God. What a great perspective. Isn't that instructive for us? As we begin to pray, to think, who is it that we're praying to? Well, for Nehemiah, he's praying to an awe-inspiring, covenant-keeping God. Nehemiah prays like one who has a high view of the Lord. And in this context of a covenant, Nehemiah recognizes that his people have done what? They've broken it. They've sinned against him. They had turned away from God. Look at the end of verse 6. Both I and my father's family have sinned. It's interesting, if you look at verse 6 and 7, he's not saying they, he's saying us, we. We have acted corruptly toward you and have not kept the commands, statutes, and ordinances you gave your servant Moses. You see, Nehemiah knew God's commands. He knew what God expected of his people. He knew what had been given in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He knew this. And now he provides a confession. It's a good example for us. I think it's instructive. He wasn't making excuses. He admitted that they had sinned. They'd acted corruptly and not kept God's commands. And so because of that, they faced judgment. They faced judgment as a nation, as a people. In fact, it was a judgment that had even been promised that they would receive if that were the path that they would go. But Nehemiah also knew that part of God's character was that he was gracious. Did you catch that? He talked about a gracious covenant. He knew that the Lord would be forgiving. Let's keep reading. Let's pick back up in verse 8. Please remember what you commanded your servant Moses. And here's a quote. It's a compilation quote, but it's a quote from the book of Deuteronomy. If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and carefully observe commands, even though your exiles were banished to the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place where I chose to have my name dwell. They are your servants and your people. You redeemed them by your great power and strong hand. We see not just that Nehemiah recognizes the brokenness, not just that he responds in prayer, but number 3, that he remembers. He's remembering God's promises. In fact, look how verse 8 begins. please remember. Some versions just use the word remember. Key word in the book of Daniel. In fact, it's used 7 other times. Remember, remember, remember. Now, of course, God doesn't forget, right? So Nehemiah is remembering, and he's putting it back as part of his prayer to the Lord, a way of recalling God's promises, asking God to apply those promises in his day, in this situation. Have you ever done that? Have you ever recalled a promise of God and said, Lord, may that be so here? You've said in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, that if we confess our sin, you would be what? Faithful and just to forgive and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Has that ever been part of your prayer? That's an example of taking a promise of God and bringing it into a current situation. Now, as I pointed out, verses 8 and 9 are a compilation quote from the book of Deuteronomy. And let me read a portion of where some of this can be found. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 1. When all these things happen to you, the blessings and curses I have set before you, and you come to your senses while you are in all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you. So again, to the people of Israel dispersed at this point, a prophecy that they would be. And you and your children return to the Lord, your God, and obey him with all your heart and all your soul by doing everything I am commanding you today. Then he will restore your fortunes, have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So just in summary, if you break the covenant, you'll be scattered. But if you return to me, I will gather you again. Verse 4, even if your exiles are at the farthest horizon, he will gather you and bring you back from there. The Lord your God will bring you into the land your ancestors possessed, and you will take possession of it. He will cause you to prosper and multiply you more than he did your ancestors. So here, in Nehemiah's prayer, he's recalling God's word, God's specific promise to restore the people when they turn to him. Now, there are 2 opposite realities for the people. It's determined by whether they remain unfaithful to God or return to him, to a right relationship. Those were their options. And Nehemiah is stating, God, we want to return. Some were already there. Some had already gone back to the city. They'd already begun rebuilding the temple. But there was still so much that lay in ruins. He's telling them, we want to come back. He's confessing sin. And that's why here in verse 8, when Nehemiah asks God to remember, he is recalling promises such as this one here in Deuteronomy chapter 30. That God will forgive and restore and bring blessing. Let me ask you, is this part of Nehemiah's prayer instructive to us? As we pray to the Lord, are there promises that we can recall? Let me give an example. You may remember a few years ago I was telling you about the great Pastor Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and that he suffered from severe depression. Just think about it. A man pastoring this massive church in London. His sermons were being typed up and put on boats and shipped all over the world. And here he is, suffering from depression. He had an understanding of despair. And he gave very vivid descriptions of it. Let me share one with you. And these quotes are found on the app, by the way. Spurgeon said, the mind can descend far lower than the body. For in it there are bottomless pits. The flesh can bear only a certain number of wounds and no more. But the soul, it can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour. Wow. That sounds like some despair, doesn't it? And there's a man that's felt some pain, inner turmoil. At one time he said, my feet had altogether gone into the chambers of despair. If it had not been for the faithful promises of the God that keeps and preserves his people. So what is it he was clinging to? The promises of God. He was clinging to them. Faithful promises. This is what he said, "Be well skilled in heavenly pharmacy, and knoweth how to lay hold of the healing virtues of the promises of God. You shall find therein an ointment for every wound, a cordial for every faintness, a remedy for every disease." What are some promises he clung to? I believe some like these. Psalm 147, verse 3, describes God as the one who heals the brokenhearted and bandages their wounds. Might that be a timely reminder for someone today? What about Psalm 94:19? "When I am filled with cares, your comfort brings me joy." Anybody here filled with cares today? Anyone down in the big room thinking about the burdens of this life? He says, "Your comfort brings me joy." What about Hebrews 13:5? "I will never leave you or abandon you." Or the King James Version, "I will never leave you or forsake you." Spurgeon was not merely advocating the remembering of God's promises, but the active receiving of them. He once told a story about a children's Sunday school class. I shared this with you one other time. And the teacher wanted to give the students an understanding of the difference between just remembering God's word and receiving it. And so he went in and he said, "I've got this nice pocket watch." Maybe one kind of like this one. And he offered it to a young boy sitting right in front of him. And in typical British demeanor, he said, "No, thank you." He didn't accept it. So then he took the pocket watch and asked another student if they wanted it. And they politely refused as well. Very nice pocket watch, by the way. Probably as nice as this one, right? Maybe nicer. Then he offered it to another. Same thing, just refused. But then finally, he offered it to a little boy, and the little boy said, "Well, thank you." He took the pocket watch and he put it in his pocket. And you know what happened after that? The other students that had declined to say, wait a minute. Wait, I didn't know. Is he going to get to keep that? Well, yes, he is going to get to keep it. I was offering it as a gift. Well, we didn't know you were going to let us keep it. We would have taken it too, right? What was his point? He's saying it's one thing to recall. It's another thing to accept. All of the students had a reason why they didn't want to take it. Were they too embarrassed? Were they ashamed? What was the reason? Did they not believe the teacher? Well, one did, and he received it. He received it. He applied it. He lived in such a way as to demonstrate his belief. Now, I know some of you are thinking it's a bold statement to bring a pocket watch in, Pastor. We're going to start asking if you look at it, if you could maybe put it on the podium and keep an eye on the pocket watch. I just want you to know that the battery in this pocket watch no longer works. And I know that's going to mean a lot of people are going to offer to put one in for me. But I digress. What was Spurgeon's point? He said this: "If the boy had grasped the promise, he has such a wellspring of delight within him that his soul would be satisfied." Any of us that would take the promises of God, he says, in a time of drought or in a time of famine, will be filled to the full. Do you believe that God's word and his promises are that powerful? Nehemiah was remembering words that brought him assurance. Assurance that God would forgive, that God would then restore his people. And so it leads us to the final verse here in the chapter. "Please, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to that of your servants who delight to revere your name. Give your servant success today and grant him compassion in the presence of this man. At the time, I was the king's cupbearer." Our final point this morning is this: Nehemiah requested divine favor. It has well been said that prayer is not getting man's will done in heaven, but getting God's will done on earth. And in prayer, in Nehemiah's prayer, God's will was at work. What began with a holy burden for Jerusalem became greater. His vision clarified what was needed to be done. And the holy burden was now beginning to take shape in an active solution. Nehemiah is receiving a calling to restore the broken walls of Jerusalem. And he begins by asking God for blessing before taking action. Now that's instructive for us, isn't it? The cupbearer was about to approach the king. Look at that verse. He says, "Grant your servant success today. Grant him compassion in the presence of this man." Yes, he was a king, but he was still a man. Thinking of Artaxerxes, the Persian king. The cupbearer was about to approach the king, and Nehemiah is asking God for favor upon that meeting. Notice that the prayer doesn't end with Nehemiah asking God to send someone else. Notice that the prayer doesn't end with Nehemiah making excuses of just how busy he is and how much responsibility he has and how far away Susa is from Jerusalem. That's not how the prayer ends. Because that holy burden is turning into what? What's the one word that I'm looking for here? Help me out. Action. The holy burden's leading to action. This was Nehemiah's "here am I, send me" kind of moment. The cupbearer was willing to leave the security of the king's palace and exchange it with the rigor and even the danger of a city lying in ruins. The holy burden compelled him, or maybe you might even say propelled him into action, but not before first praying that God would go before him. So as we wrap up this morning, here's the conclusion. The conclusion is pursue a holy burden. One commentator wrapped the passage up with these thoughts. He said, Nehemiah's prayer challenges every believer to act as an intercessor for someone else whom God can rescue from disgrace and shame. His willingness to be part of the solution illustrates the need to be willing to put feet to our prayers, even if it means moving out of our present comfortable situation and into a conflict environment where success is not assured. We started with George Mueller, so let me end with him. Remember his burden for the orphans on the streets of London. He knew the work was beyond his own ability, and that burden led Mueller to be a man of deep prayer. One morning, he was at the orphanage located in Bristol. The children were dressed, they were ready for school, and they had no food in the pantry. No money to buy any. The house mother came to George Mueller. She was in distress about the matter, understandably so. And Mueller said, "Take the children, all 300 of them, into the dining room. Have them sit at the tables." And you know what Mueller did? He prayed. And he prayed a simple prayer, thanking God for the food that he was about to provide. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. It was the local baker. He'd been up all night worrying that maybe the children didn't have enough to eat. So he got up early and he started baking bread, and he brought it right on time. But then after the bread was delivered, another knock came at the door. And I know you won't believe this, but the milkman's cart broke down right in front of the orphanage. The milk was going to go bad. He needed to get some weight off so that he could work on the tire. And he said, I don't know what to do with it other than just to give this milk to you. So that day the orphans ate fresh bread and drank milk provided just at the right time in direct answer to prayer. Just as George Mueller could not rest while hundreds of children went hungry, just as Nehemiah could not ignore the ruins of Jerusalem, God still honors holy burdens in the hearts of his people today. But let us remember that the burden is not the end in itself. It is God's invitation for us to seek him in prayer and then trust him to provide. Mueller prayed and God sent bread and milk. Nehemiah prayed, and as we will see in the coming weeks, God opens a door for him to stand before the king and eventually rebuild walls. And when we pray, God still moves in ways we could never orchestrate ourselves. So let me ask you, what holy burden has God placed on your heart? Maybe when Stephanie was giving the opening announcements, something struck you. Wait a minute, we're going to help feed hungry people? We support a ministry that deals with adoption, that deals with foster care, human trafficking. We support that. Disaster relief, that's something, people have burdens about these things. Won't be long, we're going to be talking about packing shoe boxes for Operation Christmas Child. Is that a burden? For others, they hear about after-school clubs, particularly in Pacific. Some of you have heard the report on this because it was shared not all that long ago that there are now after-school Bible clubs in each of the elementary schools. And we have many from our church that are assisting with that. That was a holy burden that led to action. Some are very burdened about the 400 children that enter this facility Monday through Friday. A holy burden to see them hear about the Lord, to be nurtured by Him, to grow in their walk with Him. These are just but a few examples. A while back, I had one of our deacons come to me. You know what his holy burden is? That God's people discover their spiritual gifts so that they can fully employ them and use them for His glory. Don't push that burden aside. Bring it to God in prayer. Cry out to Him. Confess. Remember His promises and ask for His blessing. Because when God stirs a holy burden, He intends not only to renew your heart, but I think in His economy, He intends for His plan to also bring renewal to others. Well, before we have our final prayer and our final song, let me ask you a few questions. Part of our actional insights this morning, the first one is this, and you could probably write the first question on your own. You know what's coming, don't you? What is your holy burden? And for some of you here, you know exactly what it is. For others, this might be a prayer. Lord, give me that burden. Give me that passion. Give me that desire to see in ways that you see. Secondly, in what way can Nehemiah's prayer be a model for you? We noted that it was instructive to us in so many ways, but for you, how can it be helpful? Number 3, how do the promises of God sustain you? Maybe I should ask, which promises of God should you not only be looking to and remembering, but also holding on to, embracing? Number 4, Nehemiah was asking God to supply. What are you asking God to supply? What is it that you want to see Him provide for a given situation? And finally, number 5, how can your holy burden move into a resolute action? How might that happen? What are the steps to take it from burden to action under the sovereign guidance of our holy Lord? Are you looking forward to seeing how it works in Nehemiah's life? Well, I am, even if you're not. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I'm ready to go through this book and see, what does the Lord have for me? What does He have for us